Hello, everybody. Welcome back and happy Saturday. You are all very welcome to episode 5. Today, we will be talking about sensitivity labels. Okay, so following on from episode 4, where we talk about DLP, today we're going to cover the fundamentals about what labeling is, right, why they're important, and how we use them. And as per usual, you're all very welcome. Whether you've been following the series or whether you're new, I really hope that you take away some learnings from these videos. And as the series progresses, we will be doing more advanced demos. So, with that being said, kicking off the agenda as per usual, we'll discuss what is labeling, okay, why it matters, how do we build our roadmap, and then of course we'll hop into our trusty old CDX demo and do a bit of an overview, okay? So, what is sensitivity labeling? Well, at a very high level, guys, it's policy based classification. Okay, so the idea of sensitivity labeling is that it tags and protects our data, right? And every organization will have a different sensitivity level. Okay, so by default, and we'll see it in a moment in the CDX demo, Microsoft will give every organization your public, your confidential, your highly confidential. There'll be your baseline labeling. Okay, but every organization will have different labels for different departments. Okay, now I'm a big fan of less is more. Okay, and we should walk before we should run. Okay, but the idea of labeling is that we can put a process around our data. We can identify what data is confidential, what data is general, right? And each label has, different use cases, right? So some can provide encryption, others can just do watermarking or content marking, right? There can be different access controls with each labeling that we apply to, let's say, a file or an email. It's very, very customizable, right? And that's what I love about labeling. Now, a lot of organizations, they can get a bit intimidated by it because it is very, very tailored. Okay, so labeling, there's a roadmap that we have to look at, and then obviously we can look at integrating it with DLP, and there's insider risk protocols that we can do. And then if you have a licensed AI like Copilot, right? So Copilot can actually respect your security and compliance permissions. So there's a thing called inheritance, where if you have documents that are labeled confidential and you ask Copilot to summarize those documents or pull information from those documents, right? There's a setting where Copilot, if it makes a new document, right, and the source is from a document called confidential, that new document would also be labeled confidential. Okay, so there's lots of cool ways that we can integrate labeling into our security posture and make sure that when we are using tools like Copilot, that our documents or new documents created are protected regardless of where they are in the organization. Okay, and a nice way to look at labeling as well is that it basically ensures that your data remains protected even if it leaves the organization. Okay, so if you have a label on your document and you send it outside the organization, that label will stick with the document. And again, like I said before, it can be encryption, content marking, access restrictions, whatever you're looking to do. So why does it matter, or why should we care? So obviously, a general theme, right, that I think is quite prevalent throughout this series is that insider risk is real and people share without thinking. Okay, so the idea of sensitivity labels, or one of the core features that I love, is that they protect against the accidental exposure, right? By ensuring that whatever data users are handling, it's clearly marked, right, and it's controlled. And regardless of whether it's shared inside or outside the organization, it's protected. Okay, and that gives us trust. Okay, that gives our customers trust, knowing that there is a process around our data, right? Not just sensitivity labels, right? We can look at retention labels, just labeling in general, right? You're putting a process around that data, you're identifying that data, you're tagging that data so that you internally and your customers are also very, very clear, right? This is a confidential document, okay? As part of that being a confidential document, only X, Y, and Z people can access that, right? Or it can't even leave my organization, right? Or AI can't even interact with that document because it's labeled confidential, right? And again, going back to the key point here is that protection travels with that data. Okay, so across your files, your emails, your cloud apps, it basically ensures that whatever data you're handling is protected. Okay, now when we look at labeling, and a lot of organizations, when they look to tackle labeling, right, a very, very, I guess, intimidating conversation is that roadmap. Okay, because we often find, right, as consultants or just people in the data security space, when we are dealing with customers, or even customers own IT team as well, it's having that operational conversation, and you're pulling in 20 different people, and like, well, we should label this stuff confidential and we should label this stuff highly confidential, and then we need a sub label. It can get all very, very confusing. So the way I like to do it, or the way I approach it with some customers, because every customer is different and every customer has a different appetite, right? Some customers want it done yesterday. Some customers have a timeline, so we have to adjust and we have to tailor. But it's to categorize your data in phases, okay? So when you're rolling out labeling to your specific departments, like your marketing, your HR, your IT, your finance, whatever it is, right? Every one of those departments is going to have different data types. Okay, so a phased approach, it allows us to build a template. Okay, because I'm a big fan of templates, right? Even though massive organizations, right, they're almost like 15 different individual companies, right, working under one organization. However, if you can build a template for one department, right, we can take the learnings from that, or you can take the learnings from that. You can't necessarily replicate it for another department because that department has different stakeholders and different data. However, you have a template to build off, right, and it allows us to have a much clearer roadmap, right, especially when we are tackling huge amounts of data, right, and huge amounts of customers, right. It's a very, very nice way to just kind of take a really intimidating, take a really massive project and go, okay, we're going to take it in phases. Okay, we understand that we need labeling for the entire organization. However, if we try and take on the whole organization at once, this is now going to turn into a nightmare project. Okay, so let's take IT, let's get IT right. Okay, IT is perfect. They can label their data correctly, whether it's automatic or manual. They know what their label hierarchy is. Let's move on to marketing. Can we take learnings from IT and can we complicate it, or can we move it over into marketing? So when we take, a department like IT, can we move it into marketing? Can we move marketing into finance? Right? We always take learnings when we are building a template, right? And it just allows us to see the end of the tunnel. Okay. And again, once we have a clear structure for each department, right, we can actually publish our sensitivity labels. Okay. And again, we'll talk about this in our CDX environment, but you can create tiers and you can, talk about when you decide what labels you want to apply automatically or where you want to apply them manually, right? And you can integrate them with DLP policies as well, and you can integrate them so that even our AI, such as Copilot as mentioned, can't interact, right, with certain items or certain files that have a certain label on them. Okay, and the idea of connecting labels with DLP and your general compliance policies, it's to enforce that consistent protection. Okay, so DLP and labeling, they can be done individually, but they work best together. Okay, that's what I always tell customers. Okay, is that they are their own separate technologies. However, they're all integrated. And again, going back to the Microsoft ecosystem, everything is trying to be connected. It's really important that we understand that, right? And that's how we get our best data protection, when we are understanding labeling, when we are understanding DLP, and we can mesh them together so that they can work unanimously, right? So with that being said, we're going to hop into our CDX environment. And again, guys, episode 5, we're just going to cover the fundamentals. Okay, understanding what labels are, understanding how different encryption settings can work for you. And as the series progresses, we'll get into more advanced and more juicy demos as well. So that being said, we'll hop into our CDX environment and take it from there. So we are in our Purview tenant, right? And we're in our CDX environment. So what we're seeing here is we're in the information protection tab. Okay, so Microsoft or Purview, they're always moving stuff around. Okay, so just keep an eye on the actual UI, because you never know, next week it might be called something different. Okay, so as I said before, Microsoft, they'll make our default, our personal, our public, our general, and then we have our confidential as well. And then we have some sub labels under general and sub labels under confidential. Okay, so I wouldn't worry too much about this, because again, these are templates that Microsoft have built for us. Okay, you can take learnings from it. What I want to do is I just want to take us through a very basic label process, and how we can think about making a sensitivity label, and then talk about the encryption settings and link it back to especially securing AI and why it matters. Okay, and then we're going to cover very, very briefly label policies, and then we're actually going to look at DLP very, very momentarily, and how we can actually feed our labels into our DLP policies, just to tie it all together. Okay, guys, so we are in the very first section of making our label. And as you can see, I've already sort of filled out some very, very basic information. So what we're doing is we're making a test label for credit cards, right? Test label for files or emails or documents that contain credit cards, okay? We're putting it at the highest priority. And again, label priority is just how the hierarchy of the label works and how your users will see the label as well. The description for users then, so this is quite nice. The description for users, then this is quite nice. Okay, so it's actually a tooltip that will appear for users. So if we can actually see it here, Microsoft always give us information. So yeah, a tooltip will appear for users when they view the label. So again, it just gives context in terms of what we should be labeling, and educating our users as well. Because the biggest trouble with labeling, guys, especially when we take a manual approach, is that users are always going to be difficult to handle, especially if they're not used to labeling, right? I know if I was to work in a department where all I needed to do is just get my job done, and I'm working in sales, or I just want to get the the prospect over the line and I'm sending out information and I have to add another step. The idea is that we can make it as easy as possible for our users. And again, when we look at auto labeling, we're really only looking to label 5% of our information using auto labeling, because we need to get to a place where our baseline labeling actually works, so that Purview isn't just labeling everything confidential and we're getting a bunch of false positives. And then obviously with that confidential, we have certain encryption settings. And again, like the DLP episode, we do not want IT getting bombarded by the rest of the company saying that we can't do our jobs. And on the opposite end, we don't want people who aren't in IT not being able to do their jobs either. So we'll move on to the scope. And again, what we'll see here in the scope of the label is that we have three basic, technologies that are already selected for us. Right? We have our files and other data assets like in your M365 or your Microsoft Fabric or even Power BI and Microsoft Azure. Right? We have our emails, then we have our meetings. The one that will often be blurred out is our groups and sites. Okay, so when we're looking to label any SharePoint sites or Loop workspaces, etc. So you need to enable this in your security and compliance PowerShell. Okay, so there's actually a link that Microsoft provide us here, right? So there's just a few extra steps that you need to do in PowerShell to enable this in your organization. But I do think it's a very, very useful one, because we often get customers asking us, okay, how do we, how do I label a SharePoint site? Because there's certain documents in there that need to be protected, or SharePoint site admins. There's a lot of stuff. The sites were made 20 years ago, whatever it is, right? So there's lots of stuff that we need to understand. Okay, and the way we do that is we have to go into PowerShell and enable that. But for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to click on files and other data assets, just keeping it very, very simple. And here, as mentioned before, right, so we have our control access, which is our encryption settings and who can access or view any labeled items. We have our content marking, such as your headers or footers, if you want to add watermarks to label items as well. So you'll often see in most organizations, if you get a PDF, right, that's super confidential, you'll have the word confidential at the bottom, or diagonally spread across it. Okay, so that's where that comes in. And then we can obviously protect our Teams meeting and chats as well if we find that useful. But for now, I just want to talk about control access, right, because I think this is going to be the bread and butter for most of our labels. So when we're looking to give access control, right, and use encryption capabilities to control who can access whatever label items we're deciding to classify, right? Depending on whatever scope you specified, it can be emails or your Fabric or any Power BI files as well. What I want us to look at here is, first of all, when we assign permissions, right? When we look at all of these permissions here, so by default, right, we're in the editor. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into custom, right? So obviously the one that we can change is this view content. Okay, so custom, we have to have that on, right? Because we, as an owner of a document, we need to be able to view our own document, even if it's labeled something. Okay, so by default, right, everything is turned off here, right? So this is technically the most restrictive label we could ever make, right? So we can see here, I can't view the rights, I can't edit the content, I can't save it, I'm not able to print it, I can't copy and extract it, I can't reply, etc., etc. Okay, so as we get least permissive, right, and when we're looking at our public or our general labels, right, we're going to have typically the editor turned on, right? So that means if I label something as public or general, I'm able to save it, I can print it, I can forward it, I can copy and extract the content, I can control A and control C it into a new document, etc. Okay, so the more permissive or the more restrictive we want our label to be, the less of these stuff is turned on, right? So we can see here restricted editor, printing is turned off, viewer, more stuff is turned off. Okay, so when we're looking at our highly sensitive or highly confidential data, right, we're looking to go down the list, and eventually we can go into custom and just decide what we want to have on and what we want to have off, essentially. Another really important point, right, and this links to our secure AI, is that there's one feature here, one permission, right, that is very, very important. This is the copy and extract content. Okay, so when we look at licensed tools like Copilot, okay, it links into our Graph APIs as users. So whatever we can do as users, Copilot can do as well. Our Copilot can do, right? So Copilot is different for everyone, right? And that's, unfortunately, I don't think it's communicated well enough, right? Is that my Copilot is different than Sally's Copilot in finance, and her Copilot is different than Mark's Copilot in marketing, right? Because we all have different permissions in the organization. Okay, so if I have the copy and extract content turned on, right, that means, right, stuff that's labeled confidential, right, if I have access to this label, if I've if I've been added into this label, right, so that I can actually interact with documents. I can copy and extract the contents. That also means that my Copilot can copy and extract the content as well. And it's the same on the other side of the coin. If I can't copy and extract the content, if I can only view it, right, and then I ask Copilot to summarize it, right, Copilot won't be able to summarize it because, again, the permission settings of the label state that I can't copy and extract the content. Hence, my Copilot can't copy and extract the content. Okay, and we're going to cover that in Wednesday's video, and we're going to see in real time how Copilot interacts with certain documents that are protected by a label, that aren't protected by a label, that are protected by DLP, etc. Okay, but I think it's a really important lesson and a really important learning to take away from this video is that Copilot, right, especially when it comes to labeling, will behave based on the label permissions. Okay, so it's not here to break anything. It's just here to expose what permissions you have, right, based on whatever label you decide to apply to a document. Okay, so something really, really useful, I think, and not that well known as well. So what I'm doing here, guys, is I'm just going to assign myself, right, my CDX account permissions, right, to this label, right, and what that allows me to do is basically use that content that is based that this label has applied. Okay, so you can choose from existing permissions if you're, like an author or co-author or reviewer, you can customize them as well, which we just saw. Okay, but we have to add users, we have to have groups to this label in order to actually, whoever decides to be assigned those permissions, we have to add them into this label. Okay, so we're going to save this, and again, you can decide whoever you want to add into your own labels. Right, double key encryption, dynamic watermarking. Again, we can cover those in another video, but it's not important for now. So we'll move on to auto labeling. So again, I mentioned, guys, when we're looking at labeling, we've got manual and we've got automatic. Okay, and when do we use both? Well, automatic labeling, it's a very, very nice tool in order to save yourself and save your users a lot of time, right? Because we're relying on technology to do all the heavy lifting for us, which again, I'm a big advocate of. Okay, as I'd always say, it's here to make our lives easier. It's not here to make our lives more difficult. However, when it comes to automatic labeling, we need to be very, very certain that Purview is labeling the correct stuff, right? It's not, labeling stuff confidential that it shouldn't be labeling confidential, because as we saw in our permission settings, there's some very heavy permissions there, or restrictive permissions, I should say, right? That can prevent people from sending a file, printing a file, accessing a file, if it's gets sent outside the organization, right? It can be very, very locked down. And especially now that everyone is going to adopt AI, or every organization is planning to adopt AI tools, whether it's Copilot, whether it's ChatGPT Enterprise, whether it's Claude, whatever it is, right? Again, Copilot, as an example, behaves based on your label permissions, right? So the last thing you want to do is you've auto labeling set up, but you haven't done your due diligence, and then all of a sudden, you get people saying, well, my Copilot is broken because it won't summarize my documents. Oh, it's crap. No, it's just behaving based on the permissions that you have set up in your organization, because again, it links back to the Graph API. Okay, and whatever that user can do, Copilot can do as well. So when we look at auto labeling, right, at a very high level, if I was to turn this on, so again, similar to what we saw in DLP, when we're adding our conditions and content contains, we can add our sits, right? We can add our trainable classifiers. And again, in this example, we're looking at credit cards, right? So we're going to go to sensitive info types. And if I just type out credit card, and again, I'm always a big fan. We build our custom sits, but just for this example, we'll use the out of the box one, right? So we add our credit cards there. And then this is a really neat feature, right? So we can automatically apply the label, right? Which again is the executioner. Okay, as I said before, Purview is the judge, the jury, or the executioner. So again, we're giving Purview the axe or the hammer, right, to slam down, and basically, yeah, we'll apply this label if I detect a credit card number. And again, with this label we saw, it's not that permissive, right? There's a lot of restrictions. So what I like to do is recommend that users apply the label, and then we can give a little message saying, hi user, this doc contains credit card numbers, please label, and then whatever we call their label, right? Test label credit card. Okay, so we can do that light touch, right? We can just have Purview be the jury, right? So it's good to know that we don't always have to, go from the most extreme, right? We can do baby steps, right? We can crawl, we can walk, and we can run, which is probably the best approach when we are looking at Purview in general. Okay. Now, again, this setting here, guys, is just for our, our teams or groups or sites, right, that want to have this label applied. But obviously, we didn't turn them on in the scope. Okay, we're just looking at our files and other data assets as well, so that we won't have an option here to edit any of this. Okay, so we'll just finish this label. All right, we'll create this label, and we should see a green tick. Now we've made the label, right? Oh no, like it's going to be turned on in the organization. No, it's not, right? We now have to publish this label to users, okay? Because again, if we don't publish this label, it's just sitting there, right? And we can see here, right? Publish label to users, automatically apply the label to sensitive content. I'm not going to create a policy yet. I'm just going to hit the last option here, right? Because again, we'll do a different video about publishing a label and how to publish it. But we see this label pop up here, right? And again, we can see it down there, test label credit cards. And we can move the priority up. Okay, so by default, it's at the bottom because we've just made it. But again, we can move it up, we can move it down depending on where we want our users to see it. Okay, so if we go to our label publishing policies, and again, it's probably only going to be, 2 here. If we want to publish this label, we choose our sensitivity labels. We go down to test label credit cards. We add this. We go next. Again, admin units, like we discussed in our DLP, we can ignore them for now. But again, if you do have an Entra ID and you want to restrict the policy to a specific set of users or groups, it's always good to use. Right? And then the users and groups, right? So who do we want to publish the label to? Do we want to do it for our entire organization, or do we just want to do it for our IT department, right? And again, this goes back to the phased approach. Okay, imagine if you were in an organization of 500 plus people, 1,000 plus people, 2,000 plus people, and all of a sudden everyone has a brand new label in their apps, right? And they're like, whoa, how do I do this? Or what's this? So I'm always a big fan of just applying it at a slow, steady pace. So for this one, we will just do myself, admin. And again, depending on what department you're looking to apply it to, you can give it to a group or even just a couple of users. Right, we go next on here. So again, this is quite interesting, right? We're looking at our policy settings similar to what we saw in our DLP, right? When it comes to the tooltips and, getting people to override and, providing justification. In this example, for removing a label or lowering its classification, the reason it's here is because it then gets saved in the audit log. So if I'm, working on a document and it's label confidential and I move it down to general, right? I need to provide justification. I moved it down to general because I need to send it outside the organization, right? And with a confidential label, I know based on the settings that I've configured, right, it can't leave my organization. Okay. And then we can require you use, again, a lot of this is kind of what it says on the tin, right? Require users to apply a label to their email and documents, require users to apply it to Fabric and Power BI content, and also then provide users with a link to a custom help page, which again, you can customize wherever you want it to be. So again, really depending on your appetite, guys, and depending on how you want to publish this, I always like to have justification. I think it's really, really nice to be able to go back and see it in the audit log. But again, it's really up to yourself. So what we have here is a default label, guys. So this is essentially by default, right? Any documents that contain my credit card number or any document that is applied to my or so guys, the default label, again, it's kind of does what it says on the tin, but it basically, if we have a Word or an Excel or a PowerPoint document, when we make one or modify one, it will be labeled as our default label. So there's none selected here, but because we chose test label credit cards, we can decide, okay, we want to have our default label as test label credit cards. I wouldn't recommend that, right? For now, we just want to have no default label, because again, it's not the same, but it's just, I guess it's the same concept of automatically labeling, right? Where a document is automatically labeled, right? So a default label, again, it is your default label, and we have to be very, very careful, right, in terms of how we configure this, right, depending on what organization you have. So most organizations, they might have a general as their default label. Okay, so if you're a highly restrictive organization, or if you're working in cybersecurity, you're dealing with military contracts or defense forces, you might have a highly confidential default label, right? So no matter what you make, it's all labeled as highly confidential. But again, as we saw before, we can then downgrade the label, provide justification. It just depends on your risk appetite, right, and how restrictive you want to be at a foundation level. So we're going to put it at none for now. And again, the default label to emails, pretty much what we saw in the previous setting there. A nice one, what we can see, is inherent label from attachments. Okay, so this is really interesting, right? If an email has an attachment, right, with a higher priority, right? So if I label something in let's say Excel, right, it's really, really sensitive, and I call that highly confidential, right? And then I have a default label on my emails called just general, right, or public, right? All my emails are labeled that, right? If I inherit label from attachments, if I turn that on, right, and the label that's applied to my Excel document is a higher priority, that email is also labeled as highly confidential, okay? And you can automatically replace that email's label with the highest priority attachment label as well. So it's really, really cool. And again, it's just an extra layer of encryption and security, right? That we always want to be aware of, right? Know that we can do it, right? If you don't want to do it, that's absolutely fine. It just depends on how you guys are set up as an organization. Again, this is why it's so important to take it by department, guys. You can see how granular and how complex things can get, right? So you can imagine doing this for your entire organization and your entire users, right? It's a project that would just never get done, in my opinion, okay? Depending on who's working on it and how many people are involved, right? Less is always more, but we have to do it the right way, right? We have to do it the phased way and build that template and then start rolling it out. And if you want to label meetings or calendar events, same what we saw with emails and documents, guys. It's pretty much the same sort of technology behind it, okay? And the final one being Fabric and Power BI, okay? So again, we can have our default label if we want to. Okay, but for now, we're just going to look at documents, right? We're going to ignore emails, meetings, and Fabric and Power BI. And again, if you guys want a new video about that as well, or a separate video, please let me know. Okay, so we're just going to call this policy again test label, and we'll call this just credit cards. Okay, guys, so we're just going to call our policy test label credit cards. Okay, just keep it simple so that, you know, if you have an admin or, you know, a purview admin going in and just, you know, having to review everything, is that they can put context behind everything. Okay. All right, guys, so we are in our data loss prevention section, and again, not to drag on, I just want to show everyone really quickly how we can, you know, take what we've done from labeling, right, and feed it into our DLP. And again, going back to what I said before, they can be done individually, but they work best together. Okay, so if we just make a quick rule here, and again, I'm only going to focus on the conditions. We go to add our conditions and content contains. So we're going to ignore our sits and our trainables, and we're going to look at our sensitivity labels. Okay, so we'll see the label that we, you know, have here. If we just go down to the bottom, we have our test label. We choose credit cards. Okay, and then again, our actions, we can decide, okay, restrict access or encrypt content from M365 locations. So again, guys, similar to what we saw in episode 4, right? If stuff is labeled test label credit cards, okay, and we have our email inheritance set up so that it inherits that label from attachments. So we have an Excel file and we labeled it test label credit card, but we have an extra layer of security added on as well, so that if we have that attachment in an email, that email also gets labeled test label credit card. And as a result, then if we have a DLP policy, it can monitor that, right? Our DLP alert can be sent to the right team, right? It all gets saved in the audit log regardless, but it's just adding an extra layer of security and an extra layer of alerting, which I think is really, really cool. Right, we're not just relying on sits or trainables. And again, it goes into the whole Microsoft ecosystem of everything being connected. Okay, so again, I just wanted to cover that really, really quickly, just in terms of how we can link it all together. Okay, guys, sensitivity labeling. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, I think I'm sweating after that as well. So again, it's just understanding the fundamentals. Okay, as this series progresses, keep in mind we're on episode 5. We will get more advanced. We will be looking at real use case scenarios, right, and how we can build a custom roadmap. Okay, the idea from this video is that we can understand what is labeling. Okay, how different permissions or how different encryption settings can work on a label. Okay, and how we can feed that label into our DLP policies as well, right? Not just relying on sits or trainables, and how it can all be linked together. Okay, so I really hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for the next one.